Hello, and thank you for joining us. Sorry about that. We just had a bit of a problem with the microphone. Hopefully you can hear us now. I'm sure you'll start texting and tweeting if you can't. I'm Helen Duffett. I'm your Internal Communications Manager here at Lib Dem headquarters in Westminster. And tonight I'll be putting your questions to David Laws MP, who is the chair of the Manifesto 2015 Working Group. We've already had lots of questions in already, but could you please send in some more? If you look in the box beneath the video, you can type in your questions and send them in. You may have to hit play again on the video because when you send in the questions it refreshes the screen. So if we stop talking, then just hit play again and you should be right back with us. Okay, so we'll start. So David, we're obviously the only democratic party in the UK and where our own members can actually decide policy, and that includes our manifesto for the general election, which is where you come in. For the 2015 manifesto, we're holding the biggest ever consultation that we've had so far. We've had conference sessions, a new website, and of course the roadshow, which began last week in Yeovil. And of course now we're holding the webinar too. So you were at the roadshow in Yeovil last week. What was the turnout like?
We had a very good turnout in Yeovil. I think we had 50 or 60 people, and we had an opportunity to cover all of the major potential sections of the manifesto. We had people contribute some very interesting ideas. People were very self-disciplined about not taking up too much time, so we had lots and lots of contributions, and some people came back and contributed on a number of different subjects. And there were quite a big long list of ideas that we've taken back to the manifesto group, and some particular nuggets of policy ideas that we may well want to emphasise in the actual manifesto.
Okay, well it's good that already there's been such a good turnout, and tonight we've got hundreds of people joining us on the call, and we have had hundreds of questions sent in, so we'd better get started. William Lonergan has asked, why do we need a traditional manifesto? Who's going to read it apart from some journalists, political opponents and dedicated party members? He says, I've been a member of the Liberal Democrats for over 40 years and have never once read the manifesto. He suggests we make more use of communications technologies that are now available to us, perhaps a press campaign as well to get across our core values to voters. So why are we doing a manifesto in the first place, David?
Well, it's true that millions of people don't read party manifestos, and we know that, but there are still some very good reasons for putting manifestos together. I think firstly it's an opportunity for the party and party members to agree their policy for a general election, which is very, very important. If we didn't have a formal process, then there wouldn't be an opportunity to debate this, to consult over it. And second, if lots of people don't read the actual manifesto document, we can then draw on that document as communicate our main messages throughout the more effective ways than just putting out a document for people to read. But also we need a serious manifesto with detailed policies in individual areas. When we get into a situation as we did in May 2010 where we were forming a coalition and we needed literally to go through area by area negotiating our policy priorities. If we just campaigned on the basis of a few broad themes, it would be absolutely hopeless when we got down to putting a detailed programme together for government. So yes, there are much better ways of communicating our key policies than expecting everybody to read a manifesto, but we still really need a manifesto.
And so are you confident that the manifesto will be spread far and wide and that voters will be able to see that and understand it?
Yes, I mean, I'm confident that the manifesto will be read by a core of people in the media and groups with a particular interest in specific policy areas. The media and the party and party campaigners will then communicate out from that manifesto in much more accessible ways, both over the broadcast media, opportunities such as this, through the TV and newspaper media, and all those people who are in the vast majority who don't actually sit down and read manifestos from cover to cover will pick up their sense of what the party stands for in different and more accessible ways.
So it is a niche pursuit, but perhaps these people, the opinion formers, will be able to continue to spread that message and through their particular channels, and hopefully the journalists too.
The opinion formers are important anyway, but somewhere you have to have a reservoir of the agreed priorities of the party that you can draw on, that you can communicate, that you can deal with when you get asked very detailed questions during a campaign, and that you can sit down and negotiate on if you end up with a hung parliament and you need to be able to have policy agreements across a whole range of areas. Then it's no point if you've just been campaigning on 4 or 5 key priorities. You actually need policy right across the whole arena of domestic and foreign policy.
Okay, thank you, David. Now, Layla Moran in Oxford asks, given that this manifesto may form the basis for a second coalition agreement, how will you ensure that the manifesto clearly states where our red lines are as a party, and how do you propose to determine where those red lines are?
Well, I think we will be trying to have a sense of priorities as we put the manifesto together. We'll clearly be signalling in the pre-manifesto, for example, what we consider to be some of our key pledges. Those by their very nature will be the ones in the pre-manifesto document. We will communicate through the manifesto itself by the priority we give to particular policies, how important they are to us, the things that the leader and other key party spokespeople focus on during the campaign will give a clear sense of what our priorities are. How we actually decide to spell out the things that are particularly crucial to us if we get into a negotiating position is something we still need to consider very carefully as part of the campaign and putting together the manifesto. It's very tempting to set out lots of red line areas. The problem is, as soon as you start to do so, and particularly if you do that early, people are going to say to you, well, if this is a red line, what about this area? What about this area? What about this area? And as soon as you can't say that something is important, you're in difficult territory, because it could be seen that you only have a few things that matter, and we don't want to concede important policies, even if they're not the biggest policies we're going to campaign on. We don't want to preconcede them before we even fight an election and find out what the balance in Parliament is. So I think that there have to be ways of signalling our priorities. We have to certainly think very carefully about what would happen if we got in a coalition situation and what types of policies would be policies that we'd be able to negotiate on and which we wouldn't. We must be very careful not to end up with a B-grade manifesto where people see there as being a small number of things that really count, and we don't as a party care about those other things, because that would not be healthy and it would weaken our negotiating position.
Okay, so does that mean that some of the lines may be dotted rather than solid then, or there's room for negotiation?
It means that we must consider privately very carefully what the things are that we're really passionate about, that will come out anyway publicly through the way in which we communicate these policies in the pre-manifesto and manifesto, how high a profile they have, how much we talk about them, how much we campaign on them. Whether we are going to spell out a set of red lines in a very mechanistic way is something that I still think we need to carefully consider as a party, because there are some clear advantages in doing that, but there are also some disadvantages, and we need to think very carefully about it before we decide precisely how we're going to communicate our sense of priorities.
Right, thank you. David Brandwood has sent in a question. He asks, in making our society more fair, I think we need to reduce the great disparities in income and wealth, which have been increasing in recent years. Is it our aim to create a more equal society? And if so, what ideas do we have to achieve this?
Yes, it is our aim to create a more equal society. The inequalities that we've got in this country of wealth, of income, and of opportunity should be unacceptable to any liberal. The real issue is not should we be trying to tackle inequalities, but how should we do so? The last Labour government spent quite a lot of time just on income transfers through things like the child tax credit. And that was well motivated, but the problem was that you went on having to put more and more and more in means-tested benefits into people's hands in order to try to stop inequality from widening. That can have some disincentives for people being in employment. It was meaning in some cases that people found that they were better off out of work than in jobs. And ultimately, in a liberal society, while we want a very strong safety net that prevents anybody from being in real poverty and destitution. We actually want, as far as possible, to enable people rather than create a dependency on the state. So I think Liberals particularly focus on giving people educational opportunities that are really important for people to be able to do well in life and be able to get good jobs with good incomes. So education is important. Employment opportunities, doing much more to help people into jobs are important. Making sure work pays, so reducing the tax burden on work and for people on low incomes, taking people on low incomes out of income tax altogether. Those are things that we've been giving a lot of priority to as a party and a government to try to create a nation of strong individuals, empowered individuals within an enabling state, not simply to transfer benefit monies to people and keep them in a state of dependency on the state rather than really liberating them.
Okay, thank you, David, and thank you to the other David for your question. Good evening to Andrew Emerson in Newcastle. He wants to know, do we have any plans to look at how job centres work?
Yes, I mean, I think that we have plans to look at how job centres work in a couple of respects. I mean, firstly, are they today looking after properly the interests of very vulnerable people? A lot of us are concerned about the time it's taking to assess benefit claims today, the state of people's personal circumstances that they can be left in if their claims for things like employment and support allowance take a long time to get through processing. Are we doing enough to support young people, including young people between the ages of 16 to 18, to get into employment, to get jobs? Are we helping the millions of people who were written off in previous years on incapacity benefit and what now is employment and support allowance to actually get into employment? In the 1980s and 1990s, there was a tendency to write people off if they were unemployed and to be happier in some ways if they were on incapacity benefits, so they disappeared off the unemployment numbers. That seemed to be the thrust of a lot of conservative policies in the 1980s, just to try to massage the unemployment numbers down. Now we expect job centres not just to pay people benefit, but actually to support them in getting into work if they're able to do so, and having the fulfilling existence that often comes with the social contacts of work and getting a decent income to live on.
Okay, thank you. I hope that answers your question, Andrew. Now, Mavis Iredale, I believe she's from Yeovil.
Yes, if she's the Mavis Iredale I'm thinking of. Yeah.
Hello, Mavis. Thank you for your question. She says, the most pressing concern in Europe today is youth unemployment. How do the Lib Dems hope to tackle this problem?
Well, I think that there are two priorities for us, and fortunately, but this is not something to be complacent about in the UK, but fortunately our youth unemployment is not as bad as in some of the countries like Spain and Italy, where the figures for youth unemployment are truly shocking, almost unbelievable in terms of the problems they've got. Our labour market is doing much better. We've been creating many more jobs than anybody expected over the last few years. But where there has been a slowdown in employment growth, it obviously impacts young people more than older people and middle-aged people, because it's easier for employers not to take on new people. They've tended to hold the employees that they've got, but they've slowed up recruiting new people. So youth unemployment is higher than for other age groups. So there are two things. Firstly is to get the general economy going, because that's the best thing for young people then to have the job opportunities, and we're seeing very strong employment growth, particularly over the last few quarters, and that's helping to reduce youth unemployment. But the other thing is to help the young people who are finding it difficult to get jobs. We know today in particular that there is a growing gulf between the job opportunities for young people who get good qualifications in school, university, apprenticeships and so forth, and those that leave school without decent qualifications. There's never been a bigger gap between the unemployment rate for graduates compared with young people finishing education at 16 without good qualifications. So what we've got to do, I think, is to give young people more support to get qualifications and to do well in school, give them other options than academic options if it's clear that they're not thriving in an academic environment, make sure there are high quality vocational offers, make sure that there are second chances and third chances for people that don't do well at 14, 16 and 18, because just because people fail to get the right skills and education at one age, it doesn't mean that they're not going to succeed later. So I think it's the education and skills opportunities and generally getting the economy doing better across the board that are important.
Right, so they work hand in hand. Okay, thank you for that question. Now, Ava Groenveld, she has a question about the environment. Most parties will assume an environmental sheen on them for the next election, but will lack environmental commitment at their core. How will our manifesto allow us to stand out from other parties on the environment and show people that we are the only party to safeguard our environment, our well-being, and our planet's future? So how can we make it more than just lip service?
Well, I think there are two things. I mean, firstly, we might at one stage a few years ago have felt that the environmental policy territory was getting very crowded. You know, David Cameron was trying to paint himself as very green, so were the Labour Party, so were ourselves with our long tradition of commitment to environmentalism and sustainability. Now, during these testing times over the last few years, when because of the pressures on the economy, the austerity that we've had, the other parties have been tested, people can see pretty clearly that they have dumped the environmental policies that they picked up in the good times pretty rapidly and revealed their old colours, which are not green at all. We, on the other hand, have remained very true to our environmental commitments. We've fought and battled very hard in government to make sure, even in these tough times, that there are a big priority in government for green policies, even when that requires some tough choices. We're fighting at the moment in government as part of the autumn statement to get a package of measures that tries to do the right thing for household budgets, but also not at the expense of our environmental commitments. So I think at the next general election, we'll start from the advantage of people actually seeing in government that we've made the environment a priority. We haven't walked away from our commitments just because it might seem easy to do so, in the same way that Labour and the Tories have. But we'll also have a series of very strong environmental policies in the next manifesto to show how we're going to reduce carbon emissions and show how we're going to try to green our economy in ways that will actually help people and complement the drive to improve living standards by, for example, doing much more to insulate people's homes so that actually they need to consume less energy to stay warm.
Okay, thank you. So it's our record of action and a promise of more.
It is, yeah,
really
both of those.
Time. No time before has it been more important. Okay, Jack Carrington's next. What do you envisage will be the broad strokes of the Lib Dems' preferred legislative and or executive response to the scope and actions of GCHQ? What is the Liberal Democrats' stance on an individual's right to privacy? And precisely when in the law that right could be in any way be considered secondary?
Well, this is a hugely important issue to get right, and it's something that Paddy Ashdown, as many of you will see, was commenting upon yesterday. I mean, we all know that the nature of the threats to our society today are very different from those when I was a teenager. We're facing a much greater terrorist threat, much more threats from potential cyber attacks. We don't face the same sort of conventional and mass nuclear threat that we faced in the 1980s when we had the Soviet Union around, and therefore deploying large numbers of tanks and conventional weapons is no longer relevant. Intelligence is really important. Stopping people from committing crime is really important. We know that the intelligence services have done a fantastic job in preventing lots of atrocities that would have been committed across the world, including in our country, particularly since the 9/11 atrocities in New York. That has required a lot of evidence gathering and intelligence gathering. But we can't end up as liberals in a society where we have mass snooping by the state to achieve these ends in a way that we lose all of our liberties. It would be easy to justify mass snooping to prevent any crime. You know, we could have cameras in every single street, in every single building, in all our homes, in our vehicles, tracking us for every second of the day if the only priority in society was to prevent crime and to deter crime. Actually, we also care a lot about civil liberties. None of us want to be snooped on by the state or the media, for that matter. and we have to make sure that there is a proper
balance.
balance.
Is so much easier to assume, isn't it? So it's not, a tank is obvious, but when it's difficult to distinguish those who are meaning harm from the ordinary citizen like you or I, then where can it be justified?
Well, we have to have that debate nationally, and we as a Liberal Party have a very big role to play in it, because I think we often are the only major party that has the courage to say that there has to be a line between liberty and the prevention of crime, and we don't want to live in a police state where there are small incremental gains made to our security at the price of us losing all of our liberties and being snooped on by some sort of big brother state every day and every hour of our lives. And so we will have to consider that very carefully as part of the process of drawing up the manifesto. And we have to be on guard against it every day in government, because there are always pressures to trim back our liberties in order to protect people's security, sometimes for good reasons and sometimes for bad reasons.
Right, so that's a discussion that's got to take place.
Yes,
then.
absolutely.
Okay. Julia Cambridge asks, Julia from Chesterfield asks, people in Chesterfield want to feel they are being listened to. What is important is to have a good quality of life brought about by financial security. A strong economy and strong social safety nets will do this. What further help are we going to offer the middle to low paid, those without kids or with grown-up ones?
Well, the first thing is we're going to go on trying to do what we've been doing since 2010, which is allowing people to keep more of their income that they earn, raising massively the personal income tax allowance. People said in 2010, including David Cameron, that we'd never be able to raise the tax allowance from 6,500 to 10,000 in a parliament, that we couldn't afford it. He said, now we're delivering it. It's coming in April 2014, and Nick Clegg is now talking about the next moves to increase that tax allowance. And that's really important, because people on £10,000, £12,000, £14,000 are not rich by any sensible person's standard. And if we are going to help them with their living costs, and if we're going to help to give strong incentives for people to work rather than be on benefits, then actually allowing people to earn more of their money before they start paying income tax is really important. So that's one very powerful thing. There are also measures that we can take in areas such as childcare to help people, and obviously making sure the economy prospers and that people have the right skills means that people can then get the employment which actually will pay them a decent wage without having to rely upon interventions from government.
Okay, so it's thank you. So Stace Williams sends in a question. Are there plans to actively seek out and engage with various groups and specified associated organisations within the party to work on any manifesto commitments relative to them? She's thinking of transport and FE policies for young people, perhaps mental health, rather than wait for them to seek the party out. So is there going to be outreach?
Yes, there is outreach, as well as encouragement for people that want to talk with us. I mean, obviously the consultation over policy is not just down to the manifesto. We have, over the last couple of years, and we're doing it still in 2014, had a lot of new policy making through the traditional conference and federal policy committee process, where policy groups are established. They go out and consult very actively with groups outside and inside the party, take evidence, and then come up with their conclusions. And in the conferences in the spring of this year and in the autumn, we've got very big policy papers on things like immigration, on crime, on public services, political reform. And so those policies will feed directly into the manifesto. So we're doing this through the manifesto group and through the policy groups that have been set up.
Okay, so what would your advice to Stace be if Stace has a particular idea? What's the best route?
Well, I would either come along to one of the consultation sessions, or if you are a member of one of the formal groups that's going to feed into the manifesto, do that, or go online and feed into the online manifesto site, where we're getting lots of ideas, all of which are read very carefully by the manifesto group. And I'm taking home tonight a whole load of recent comments that have been put on there to read them one by one. We can't give massive detailed feedback on every single one, because literally it would take most of my day to do that, but we will read them very, very carefully and pay attention, A, to the issues that people are concerned about, and see what it is that party members think are the particularly important issues, but also look out for those policy ideas that we haven't thought of to see if we can put some of those into the manifesto.
Right, okay. So are you finding that manifesto suggestions are naturally batching into categories? Is there anything that's overwhelmingly causing more interest at the moment?
I'd say there are quite a few different issues that people are raising. I mean, being Liberal Democrats, there are lots of issues about political reform. There's also a lot about education that I've seen coming in, quite a lot about welfare reform. Those are probably the three big areas that I've seen in the most recent submissions.
But you're open to new suggestions too?
Open to suggestions on any policy area, and we're getting a huge breadth of ideas coming in.
Good, that's good to hear. Okay, so Nigel Bain, he's got a question about the EU. Why can we not present the case more forcefully for staying in the EU, especially now that the CBI and leading business people as individuals have come out in favour? And to enumerate in as much detail as possible the areas which the UK wants renegotiated. Are we making our case forcefully enough? Do you think we could do better?
I think we are making our case very forcefully. I don't know whether you saw the speech that Danny Alexander gave yesterday to one of the business groups. I mean, it was a very blunt statement of the case for Britain being in the European Union, a very blunt case about the dangers of distracting the United Kingdom from economic recovery with this talk about having a referendum that would damage business confidence, risk encouraging people to invest elsewhere. The truth is that most sensible people know that we ought to be members of the European Union. It's very, very important for our trade. It's very, very important for our businesses. If we were not in the European Union, we'd have to do what many of the other European countries do who are not in the EU, which is end up actually paying money and making a contribution to the EU in order to be within our trading bloc, but without the influence to be there sitting around the table creating the rules. And as liberals, we don't want to see some great European superstate with ever more powers sucked into Brussels, whether they need to be there or not. We believe in a devolved European Union where powers reside at the lowest level possible. That's what we believe in the United Kingdom. It would be bizarre if we had a different view about the European Union. But the European Union is there to do some of the big things that nations can't do by themselves: cooperation about open trade, cross-border crime, the environment, and so forth. There are plenty of other things that can be located at a national or subnational level. And actually, these days, with the broadening of Europe, with the widening of Europe, with the increasing number of countries, there are lots of other countries that have that British view of Europe and that want to cooperate with us to make sure that powers reside at the same level. And we should be trying to make allies in Europe to reform the European Union in sensible ways, rather than making enemies and painting Britain as the one person in the playground that nobody really wants to talk to.
Okay, so is this a time for renegotiation on our part?
I think that there have been much bigger priorities in the European Union over the last few years. The economic recovery has been the first priority. I don't think we want to be unilaterally renegotiating our position in the EU. But what we do need to do, particularly as the European economy begins to normalise, as we begin to find the time to be able to discuss some of these wider political issues, of course we want to look at whether there are ways that we can do things better within the EU. Are there some powers that it would make sense to be cooperating on more? Are there powers that the EU has that should be devolved back to a national level? But far better to have that debate with other European countries, where there are plenty of people that think that there are things that should be changed in the European Union, rather than Britain thinking that it's the only country that's entitled to try to restructure the way the European Union works and take a sort of unilateralist approach to the future of the European Union and Britain's role within it. I don't think that's very likely to work, and I don't think it's in the interests of our country.
Okay, thank you, David. And please keep sending in your questions, whether it's via Twitter or the box on the website that's in front of you. And just as an aside, David, Dr. Jenny Woods says, tell him, Jenny says, thank you for listening to her civil liberties rant in Yeovil last Thursday. And actually, while we're on the subject, what next for civil liberties in the Lib Dems? Is that going to be a major part of the manifesto?
It's always going to be a huge part of the manifesto for us, and what we've learnt in government is that if you don't have the Liberal Democrats standing up for civil liberties, you're not going to have a major British party taking that position and looking after the nation's civil liberties. The parties, when they get into opposition, often find that it's attractive in the short term to make a civil liberties argument. The Conservatives did so when they were in opposition to Labour. But the natural force for the Labour Party and the Tories when they get into government is to end up taking often the non-civil liberties side, the side of big government. And it's in our DNA that we believe in civil liberties. Therefore, we can not only put that case in opposition, but we can seek to defend civil liberties when we're in government. And we need to have a very strong narrative and policy platform to strengthen civil liberties in the next manifesto.
That's essential. Thank you. I look forward to that one too. Now, Michael Griffin, education. If we want to build a knowledge-based economy, it makes sense to invest in education. Could a requirement be introduced to make it compulsory for teachers, or new teachers at the very least, to have gained a qualification in teaching? And Michael says this should apply to both state schools and private schools. He says, would you employ a plumber who'd not been trained as a plumber?
Well, I certainly think that it should apply to state-funded schools. I mean, personally, I think that if people choose to send their children privately, then they are taking the risk of whether or not the school is going to deliver a good education. And I think there is a difference between privately funded and state-funded schools in that regard. But our party's made very clear that we believe that all teachers in state-funded schools should have a qualified teacher status, or they should be working towards it. Does that mean that there can't be some people who don't have QTS who might do a good job? Yes, some of those people might do. They might be really good at their particular subject. But being a good teacher doesn't just require good subject knowledge. It requires an understanding of how to teach, of how to communicate, of how to identify particular challenges and educational needs young people have. And to do the job really well, you need to have those skills. So I think that all teachers should have qualified status, and I think actually we ought to look at the existing qualified teacher status to see how we can enhance it and strengthen it and make it not just a one-off process at the beginning of your career, but link it to continuous professional development and recognition of the skills that teachers build up over a period of time. I'm not actually sure it's ideal just to have it as a one-off event at the beginning of a career. We want to support teachers and require teachers to grow their knowledge and their skills over time and to recognise that.
Well, that's good. That sounds as though it will build up teachers' confidence. But what about the parents' confidence? Will they be able to be confident that they're sending their children into good hands?
Yes, I mean, I think that this is what Nick Clegg was talking about in his speech a few weeks ago, that he wanted really in a more autonomous school system where we have got the academies and free schools as well as maintained schools. Nick felt that, you know, we really need some kind of guarantee to parents of some minimum standards in state-funded schools, a guarantee that the teachers will be trained and qualified teachers if they're in state-funded schools, a guarantee that every pupil will have some sort of minimum curricular entitlement so that they will all get exposed to the basics in education that most parents would expect them to hear about during their time in school, that they should get access to school food that should be healthy. So I think we don't want to ladle loads of extra regulations on schools, but we do want some minimum standards that all parents sending their children to state-funded schools can expect and can know that they are secure in receiving whichever one of those schools they send their children to.
Okay, thank you, David, and thank you for that question. Now, this one's on Scottish independence, and it's from Alan Heron. Thanks for your question. He says, on the assumption that Scottish independence is rejected in the 2014 referendum, how can we best ensure that UK governance is reformed alongside the pressure for additional powers? More specifically, how can we progress federal structures within the UK, albeit on an asymmetrical basis?
Well, I think that's a very good question, and we've obviously made some announcements recently in relation to Wales to offer Wales more devolution of powers. And we have generally, as the United Kingdom, been a country that when there has been a clear message from any one of the nations of the United Kingdom that they do actually want more devolution, more ability to make their own decisions, we've given that to the nations of the United Kingdom. What most of us believe is that the United Kingdom is, however, stronger and better together, and I want Scotland to stay within the United Kingdom. I think so far the majority of Scottish people want that as well. But we've been looking, and Min Campbell has led a commission to investigate this. We've been looking at whether there could be further powers granted to Scotland and Wales and other parts of the United Kingdom if they want that. And we should continue to look at that process of devolution from central government after the Scottish referendum vote and into the next Parliament. And that's not just about devolution of powers to Scotland and to Wales and to Northern Ireland. It's also potentially devolving power within England to areas of England that want to exercise more power.
Okay, thank you, David. Now, fracking. Bill Shaw asks, what is the Lib Dem position on fracking for oil and gas in Somerset?
Well, we have taken a position in Somerset which is the same as that which was approved by the party at its conference earlier this year, where there was a very full and very good debate about fracking, about its potential upsides and all of the risks involved. So I think that the position that the party came to on it was a very sensible one, a very pragmatic position that did see the potential for benefits, but also saw the potential costs in parts of the country that might be affected, in environmental risks that there could be if we simply undertook fracking in a way that was not properly controlled. And I think that that balanced position that was set down by the party in the autumn conference is one that most members of the party do support.
Okay, so is the position on fracking likely to be the same wherever throughout the country then? It's not particular to Somerset or whatever?
I think the principles that we set out in the autumn conference are ones that are likely to be applied across the country. Obviously, as a party that believes in local decision making and local choice, we want to leave some latitude for people to be able to feed in within the framework that we set out in the autumn conference. But I think people are likely to take a similar attitude to the upsides and downsides wherever they are in the country.
Right, and will geology have a say as well then? It would be tailored to local conditions?
Yes, look, I don't pretend to be the world expert on the geology of fracking, but clearly those issues relating to geology and other risks, which we set out the principles of in the autumn, need to be applied to the realities on the ground, and those will vary across different parts of the United Kingdom depending upon the geology.
Okay, thank you, David.
But if we go to get into much more detail, we might need to get Ed Davey on, who will be able to speak at very great length and with more confidence on this than I can at the moment.
Good. Okay, well, there's still a wide breadth of subjects to test you on.
Good.
So the next one is social care funding. So we might need to get hold of Norman Lamb if you can't do this one. Let's see. Cara Jenkinson says, what will be our policy for social care funding? Council funding cuts have meant less money for adult social care, which impacts on NHS spending. Will we have integrated NHS social care funding that provides net greater funding for social care? Excuse me.
Yes, and I think we've seen the first big strides towards this in the spending review in July, where actually we did free up a lot of money within the health and social care budget to be used potentially to enhance social care, in order to try to treat more people outside hospital, both to save on cost, but also to provide a level of care that meets people's needs rather than the institutions where we've allocated money. This is something that Norman Lamb, our health minister, is incredibly passionate about. He's probably the lead minister on this in government. He's doing some very good work, and we've already put in place the building blocks of this, not just in terms of policy, but in terms of real cash. Social services traditionally has often been a Cinderella area compared with health and education, in inverted commas, schools and hospitals, as politicians often describe those areas as. But I think now there is a much more a clear understanding from people on the health side that they do need social services to work, and that they're only going to run an effective health service and one that can manage the budget pressures if social services are given the priority that they deserve.
Exactly, thank you. James Cox, will electoral reform be pursued in the next Parliament?
Yes, it will be pursued in the next Parliament, because it's something that the Liberal Democrats are very passionate about. So the more votes and the more seats we have, the more we will be able to prioritise electoral reform. How we do so, the party has got to consider very carefully in the run-up to the 2015 general election. We obviously had the massive disappointment of losing the AV referendum vote in this parliament. We can't simply wish that away. We've got to think about how and in what way we can test the public mood on this again. We've got to think about whether we can promote proportional representation in local government. We've got to think how we take the Lords reform agenda on in the future and how we get elections for the second chamber. So yes, we will undoubtedly take forward the proposals on fairer voting, but how we do that and which areas we particularly prioritise, those are really important decisions for the manifesto.
What do those decisions depend on then? Is that down to member suggestions, or will it be down to negotiations with other stakeholders such as the other parties? Are we going to try and
the
system? Or?
In the first instance, they depend upon us as a party, I think, deciding on where our priorities are and on which areas we think we can progress most in the next parliament, given not only what's happened in this parliament, but the results of the next election. Some of those decisions we can take in advance of the 2015 general election. Some of them we'll only be able to take once we know the balance of seats in the next parliament.
Right, but we're not giving up on electoral reform.
We are certainly not giving up on electoral reform.
And Lords reform, that's not gone away forever, has it?
That has not gone away either. I mean, all of these things are things that we're still deeply committed to. The forces of conservatism with a small c and a big C have impeded some of these in a pretty major way in this parliament. But that doesn't simply mean that we're going to give up. We're going to come back to them. Many of these things are popular with the public. It's a matter of assembling the right coalition of support around the right policies.
So there's an appetite then for it?
There is an appetite for it, but we have to make sure that we pay heed to, firstly, where we're likely to make most progress, secondly, to what's happened in this parliament. And we also have to make sure that we set our passion for political reform in a context that people will understand in terms of the other priorities, because undoubtedly in this parliament the economy has been uppermost in people's minds and people have wanted to see us give first priority to immediate economic measures. So we have to make sure that we take forward this agenda, but in a sensible way that recognises what's happened in this parliament and also put political reform in its proper context.
Proper context meaning?
Well, versus if we went into the next election and the top 5 priorities in our manifesto were all about political reform, then I think people in large parts of the country would say, well, hang on, we can understand that political reform can be important, but we want to hear about education, we want to hear about taxation, we want to hear what you're going to do to restore economic growth and youth unemployment. So political reform is important, but it's not the only important thing. And it has to be set properly in its context, and people have to see that we're giving it the right amount of attention, not too little, but not too much versus other very big issues too.
And then present it in a way that people can understand.
And then present it in a way people can understand and explain how it will affect their own lives and how it does relate to getting the right decisions on the economy and on the environment and on education, because it's about it's what proportional representation and political reform delivers in terms of real change that is as important, if not more important, than a technical issue about how you vote.
That's just process, isn't it? Okay, so we've learnt lessons from the AV referendum, and there's an awful lot to take forward. I'm very glad to hear that it's not over yet. So Lisa Brett wants to know, what is the future of police and crime commissioners, and will there be something in the manifesto about that?
Yes, I mean, I don't want to preempt the Home Affairs and Crime paper that's being written at the moment, and I think it's going to be debated at our, I think it's the autumn conference. I think we've got a consultation session in the spring conference. Maybe I've got that the wrong way around. Some of you will probably know, but we're going to be making policy on this at our conferences this year, and that will update our position on police and crime commissioners. We weren't supportive of them prior to the coalition government. We would rather have kept or adapted the existing structures, but we made that compromise as a coalition compromise. When we're setting our manifesto for 2015, we don't have to make compromises, we have to set out what our preferred option would be, and we will effectively, almost certainly, just translate whatever is agreed by conference straight into the manifesto on this.
Right. Okay.
So people who are concerned about police and crime commissioners and they have strong views ought to make those known now to the group that are putting crime policies together, and make sure that if you've got alternatives, or if you support police and crime commissioners or you don't, that you get those views fed in pretty rapidly.
Right, so now is the time to make those thoughts known. When are we publishing the manifesto? Do you know yet?
Well, we'll be publishing a pre-manifesto in the run-up to this year's autumn conference, and we'll be debating that at the conference. And that's very, very important, because that really is, in some ways, a boiled-down version of the big priority issues that we've identified that we really will want to be campaigning on in the run-up to the election. It's effectively a first slimline draft of the manifesto. It doesn't mean we can't add things later, and certainly we will add more detail, but that is a really important process, and we'll debate it and potentially amend it at conference. We will then have the actual manifesto that will be launched in the normal way at the beginning of the election campaign, and that will include all the great detail about each area of the policy.
Okay, but it makes sense not to leave it too late. This is the time when people are considering in detail suggestions.
The big decisions, which is really important for people to understand, the big decisions on our manifesto will be taken really between now and June, July, and then at our conference in September. That will frame the big decisions we make on most of the issues. Of course, it will be possible for the manifesto group, for Nick Clegg, for the Federal Policy Committee to change some of the policies and update them between September, October and March, April next year. But our intention is to make the big decisions by this autumn, so that we can say to party members and campaigners, these are the messages, go out and sell them between now and May 2015.
Right, good. So it's timely to get in touch.
Do not wait until January next year, well, I mean in 2015, or December 2014. Good ideas of what we want to hear in the next 6 months, and then it gets more difficult to incorporate them. Not impossible, but more difficult. Good,
okay, so that's advice straight from David there. Please get in touch as soon as possible. Thank you. Michael Griffin has another question about education. Can Ofsted inspections of schools be changed so that schools are not aware the inspection is going to occur? He suggests a surprise visits, and that private schools should also be subject to Ofsted inspections too. So at the moment, schools get plenty of warning and teachers prepare. What would you think to surprise visits?
Well, we are essentially doing very short notice visits. I think now schools generally get 24 hours notice. The Chief Inspector wanted potentially to do no notice visits, but I think for the vast majority of schools that would be going a bit over the top, because obviously there's a risk. What happens if the head teacher's off for that day? They might have something special arranged in the school. I think any of us, if we were suddenly found we were inspected in our workplaces at no notice whatsoever, might feel it was unfair, because there might be something going on which wasn't normal. But having short notice is good, because it means that we're more likely to see the school as it actually is, rather than having a presentation put on. And also the Ofsted process is quite stressful for schools. It is quite high stakes. And actually, by telling people months in advance, we would divert them from their job of getting on with teaching and running the school properly, because they'd be spending too much time preparing for the inspection. We don't want that to happen. We want the inspection to show a school as it really is, and not have schools preparing for months on end. So now we do have most inspections very short notice, but giving some notice.
So yes, as a parent and a school governor, I've seen schools going through all sorts of contortions and worries. It's mainly the stress. Rather than the actual preparation itself, it's the worry about it. If they feel that they are being taken at face value as they are, fairly, with allowances made, do you think that's a good, fair way to do the inspections then, as long as the inspectors understand that things won't be perfect and artificially ready? Do you think that's a good balance?
Yes, and I think you'll never have a perfect system to inspect schools and hospitals, and it will always be controversial, and there will always be an ability to argue about the borderlines between one grade and the next. But I think on the whole, Ofsted does a pretty good job. I think it's very, very important. I talked to a lot of schools about their Ofsted inspections. I went out on an Ofsted inspection myself in a school a few months ago to see how it worked. I don't think they do a bad job today, and I think they do a very, very important job.
Good.
And the other thing to say is that they under the Chief Inspector, Michael Wilshaw, they are using many more practicing head teachers now who are going as inspectors, right. Who therefore know how schools are run, have current experience, understand what it's like to have their school inspected, and can try to make the process a more useful one for schools. So it's not just about comment and criticism, but also about advice about what the schools should be doing to improve.
Good. That sounds like a fairer way forward. Now, party funding, David. Caroline Smith says, how can funding for all parties be regulated in such a way that parties are successful not because they have rich funding sources, but because of the value of their ideals and the wisdom behind their policies?
Well, I think we do have to reform party funding. We should have reformed it in this Parliament. Unfortunately, the other two parties are dinosaurs in this area. They have their interest groups, the unions on the one hand, big business on the other. They don't really want the system to change. But the truth is that the existing system of party funding isn't fair, and potentially it gives too much clout to particular groups that have got lots of money. That's damaging and dangerous for democracy, as we see occasionally when various scandals break out. I believe that we could reform party funding in a way that cleaned the system up, which made it fairer, which took away some of the risks, and I believe that we could do it in a way that made savings in some areas of government budgets in order to deliver the party funding, so that we didn't have to ask the taxpayer to reach further into his or her pocket to fund this.
Right. Okay, thank you. And we've only got time for one more question. Thank you for your time so far, David. And the final question goes to Annie Adcock. And she says, I would like to see the Lib Dems being the party encouraging us all to take much more responsibility for our own health and well-being, to reduce the pressure on and to reduce the costs of NHS services. Will the manifesto challenge us all to be proactive rather than demanding?
Yes, I think this is incredibly important. I mean, we need to do much more to avoid having to treat ill health, which is not only incredibly expensive, but, you know, very bad to become ill. The whole purpose is to try to avoid illness, and yet we spend far too much money at the end of the system rather than at the beginning of the system on prevention. Exactly the same with crime. You know, for years we spent so much on the criminal justice system and on policing, when we ought to be designing out crime from the system. And I had a really interesting meeting with Norman Baker and Nick Ross, who used to be on the UK Crime Watch programme recently, to talk about ways in which we can design crime out of the system rather than designing expensive interventions that we actually in today's environment can't easily afford. So in both health and crime, we need to put a much stronger emphasis on prevention. Okay, any ideas so far about health and better, prevention of ill health? Have you got anything so far? I think Norman Lamb is working very actively on this as our health minister, and he is bringing forward, along with the Public Services Working Group, proposals on this that we will be debating, I think, in the autumn conference. Good. Okay. Well, I look forward to seeing those. Thank you, David, for your time this evening. Thank you very much. And there will be a recording available. We'll put that somewhere for you to see, hopefully the next day, on YouTube or on the party website, so that you can show it to people who've missed it. Thank you very much for sending in all your questions, but please don't stop feeding into the manifesto process. There are still several more roadshow dates, and we'll be emailing you about those very soon. And at any time, please do email in with your manifesto suggestions. And so from Lib Dem HQ in Westminster, I've been Helen Duffett, your Internal Communications Manager, and I've been talking to David Laws MP. Thank you. Thank you very much, and good night.